the Rise Up See Red podcast, all about the Arizona Cardinals and the NFL, featuring insider and outsider perspectives. Enjoy the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Now here are your hosts, Jess Root and Seth Cox.
Hello, Arizona Cardinals fans, and welcome to the latest edition of the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best hour Cardinals talk on the web. I'm your host, Jess Root from CardsWire.com, USA Today NFL Wire site. With me on a second show of the week, our show 2 of the week, is Seth Cox from RevengeOfTheBirds.com, SB Nation's Arizona Cardinals site, and also one of the hosts of the original Draft Breakdown podcast, which is This is Prime Draft Podcast time of year. We plugged their offensive line show that they had with Sully Chiefs earlier in the week. If you haven't heard that, make sure you download that. And then for those of you who have not yet jumped on and become one of their patrons and gone on one of their tiers of additional bonus content for $2 a month, you can get their bonus shows that they do each week. The one they recorded this week, they each they ranked their top 5 offensive line prospects. And on the second tier, the higher tier at $4 a month, you can also get their written content as well, both from Seth and co-host Justin Higdon. We've had Justin on the show for a couple of shows for the last 3 years, so you guys have heard him. But this is our second show of the week, and we've got a little bit of stuff to talk about. Seth, we have some signings that they are not overwhelming signings, but as these are at least not head scratchers, they fill 2 positions on defense of need with guys who have experience. These are low-key all-right signings. Let's talk about that. Carlos Watkins, defensive lineman, and Rashad Fenton, cornerback. Those that we're recording on a Thursday evening. These announcements came from the team Thursday afternoon and Thursday evening, so we get to react to them right away. Seth, I like the moves. These are low-key smart moves, and rather than just cheap moves, but I like them.
Yeah, and it's, one of those things where, and I wrote about it, they're both guys that have started a lot of games in the NFL, so that's good. But they've also been, high-level rotational players in the NFL as well. And so from that perspective, you've got, low-end starters or high-end impact backups, and those are both important things that they need. And so when you look at it, I think it's kind of what we've been waiting to see from them, more outside of, like we said, with Kaiser White. None of the other signings have been anything to write home about. It's been a lot of guys that are going to be
this isn't quite Kaiser White, but it's also not Zach Pascal. Let's be honest. And it's not like we didn't like the Pascal signing, but we knew he's low-end receiver, 3-4 plus special teams. Fenton could start. Watkins could start. Either one of them, and as the cornerback room looks right now, Fenton should be part of the 3 cornerback rotation.
Right, and so you look at it, you've got a really nice addition to the cornerback room who can be a guy that, if you need him to, can start. If not, he is a guy that has played that backup role. And that's the thing, is you look at it, all of a sudden you've got now multiple guys in Fenton and Marco Wilson and Antonio Hamilton who have started or came off the bench, and those things really can't be overstated, how important it is just to have that many guys in terms of that do that, right?
Right.
That can be either that type of player. And you look at it, I'm looking right now. So he played 386 snaps last year. In 2021, he played 639 snaps, mostly at wide corner, but he did play some in the slot, not a ton. So I don't want people to think.
Well, and we already know that Antonio Hamilton can play inside. That was the role that they kind of had him in 2020 when he started early. And,
And then
granted, Marco Wilson, they viewed him. This is the last regime. Steve Keim also said that he has the ability to go inside and out.
And then you look at it in Fenton in 2020, because he was so that was his second year. He played basically half of his corner snaps at slot. He played 236 in the slot, 260 wide. So like, I mean, basically did both. And then his rookie season, which, you know, for a 6th rounder to play over, you know, I think it ended up being right around 300 defensive snaps is a ton. And he played most of them out of the slot. So like, he's a guy with a lot of experience outside, a lot of experience inside. It's just a good, solid signing where we haven't talked about the signings in that way. We've looked at him as strong depth, right? Like strong backup potential. And now you've got a guy outside of who was it? Woods.
Chris Barnes. Chris Barnes is kind of the
Barnes, and then who was the other linebacker? Who's the special teams?
Josh Woods.
Josh, okay, it was Woods. Okay, yeah. So outside of the Woods signing, where you're like, oh, this is a special teams guy. Like he's like this is the first. These two signings are the first signings where you're like, oh, they went and got guys that can help. Like, whether it's starting or rotational, but they can play 5, 6, 700 snaps, and you're not like, oh, I can't believe this guy's still out on the field. Because
right.
I mean, let's also be honest. This guy played. I know he got traded at the trade deadline, but this guy played for the Chiefs in 2 Super Bowls, and then the guy we're about to talk about was a heavy rotational player in Dallas, right, this year, who ended up being in the playoffs. So like, both of those things are great.
Yeah, and the Watkins move, he doesn't have eye-popping numbers, but his best seasons were 2020 and 2021. And it's interesting if you look at his Pro Football Reference. Kind of, I didn't look at some of the breakdowns, but he's a 305 pounds, so you'd think he's going to play the interior. They had him, and I think he's got some positional flexibility as well, so he can kick out wide. He was even listed one year when he was with the Texans as an outside linebacker. That would have been a one that Houston plays at 3-4. That was the when they were who was their coordinator then? Romeo Crennel.
Oh, Romeo. Okay.
And so Jonathan Gannon, one of the things we're going to talk about is this schemeless or this scheme flexible defense. And if you have guys that can play multiple spots, it looks like Watkins is a guy who's flexible enough to play across the defensive line.
Right. And you look at it, this year he played mostly on the interior, 300 snaps. He played 105 at left tackle, defensive left tackle, and then 146 at defensive right tackle. In 2021, he played 468 snaps, again, most of them on the interior, but he did have some more on the edge that season. So you just look at a guy that, again, that you're talking about, and we've emphasized this with defensive linemen, especially 400 to 500 snaps is ideal for these guys to rotate in, unless you just have an absolute alpha. 50% of the snaps is all you want these guys playing. Like you get a rotation going and things like that, because unless you have an elite player, and I think that's what people don't get, but unless you have an elite player, expecting them to play 700 snaps on the defensive line is just not something that you see a lot. Like if you go to Philly, the reason Philly was so good is because they have Javon Hargrave and Fletcher Cox, and they both played over 800 snaps, right? Like that's a lot of snaps for defensive linemen. And so when you look at it, that's not how most teams work, because most teams don't have those guys. Most teams have one of those guys, right? Like,
yeah, they'll have one guy that they can play a lot. Like even if you look at the Cardinals the last few years, Zach Allen played the almost all the snaps kind of role. before Calais Campbell was in that role when he played for the Cardinals. Like, he played almost every snap inside. And so they always J.J. Watt played a variety of roles, but they had two guys that they play, and they tried to limit Watt.
Right. But I mean, you just look at it. Like, you go to the Jets, even Quinnen Williams, who was an All-Pro this year, he played 690 snaps. And like I said, those other guys in the regular season, are playing that many, and you just look at it, and the next guy on the list for the Jets was 550, so 140 less snaps. Like, so you're talking about 8 to 10 less snaps a game, and you might be like, oh, that's not that many. But like, when Williams is playing 70% of the snaps, the next guy down is now playing 55. Like, so you want guys that you can trust, that are rotational guys. And again, Watkins is not what you would call like a sexy signing by any means, but he's a guy that teams need to be successful.
He's not a head scratcher of a signing.
No. And that's the thing, is like, again, I think the best, way to paint this picture is just to give examples. And you got, again, like, you look at the Cincinnati Bengals, right? The Bengals top snap getter this year on the defensive line, or interior defensive line, was BJ Hill at 815. The next interior defensive lineman had less than 400 snaps. Like, that's how defensive line should work.
Yeah.
Like, you should have, in an ideal scenario, in a 4-4-3 defense, what we are kind of expecting the Cardinals to line up in, you should have 4 guys that are playing roughly 45 to 50% of the snaps each.
Yeah. And what I like about this signing, like, some of the other signings, you're like, ooh, maybe they get, like Kevin Strong, one of the defensive lineman signings that they made. He's a guy who's been, like, at best he can maybe start. Or you go to the offensive line when they signed Yelda Froholt. These are the guys like, oh, he started before, but and so these two are guys who have been legitimate, consistent-ish starters.
Right,
they're much easier. They're much easier to project to be productive, and not just bodies on a roster, but guys who you can count on. Where if they are in the starting lineup, you're not like imagine if we go into the season with Yelda Froholt as the starting center, we're going to be wondering about the center position. If Watkins is one of the starters on the defensive line, or if Fenton ends up being a start in quarterback, sure they could be upgraded. Sure they could, but we're not going to go. I don't know.
Right. And that's kind of where I think you and I are, right? Like, we've tried to explain and prepare people that this is not going to be a year where you expect this team to go for it, so to speak. However, this is a year where I think people are going to be, and a lot of it plays into, when Kyler comes back, but I think people are going to be surprised by this team, by how hard they play, by how physical they play. And that's the type of things and signings we're seeing right now.
Coming next on the Rise Up C-Red podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the web. Let's move on. Talk about some stuff that's come up in some reports about DeAndre Hopkins and a potential trade. That's coming up next on Rise Up C-Red. We're back on the Rise Up C-Red podcast, best of Cardinals talk on the way. We've talked on several shows about the potential of a DeAndre Hopkins trade. It wasn't too long ago that Pac-Man Jones was on the Pat McAfee show and named 5 teams to watch for. One of those teams was the New England Patriots. On Thursday, in an ESPN kind of notebook, when Jeremy Fowler and Dan Graziano, it's always fun to read those, because it's like those two guys like collaborate. They collaborate on their news and notes that they picked up from where they've been, whether it's at the Combine, or in this case, it was here in the Phoenix area when they had the annual league meeting at Biltmore in Phoenix, and just things that they came away with. And there were 2 tidbits about DeAndre Hopkins in a potential trade, and this has kind of been consistent. There's been a couple things that have been very consistent with the Cardinals, is that teams want them to come down off their asking price, and their asking price has been firm. They want a second-round pick plus something. And as of right now, they're not coming off of that price. Now, there were two things that came up in this notebook from Graziano, and I think both were actually notes from Graziano. And one was surprise that the fact that the Patriots having offensive coordinator Bill O'Brien, the former head coach of the Houston Texans, and who traded Hopkins away, with whom Hopkins said he admittedly had no relationship with, that the presence of O'Brien on that staff happens to be an impediment to a potential trade. Surprise. And then the other one is how teams want the Cardinals to eat some of that money. I will say this. The Cardinals eating some of the money, while it might make things easier, makes at least no sense at all. We've already broken down the numbers when it comes to that, because he has a cap hit of over $30 million this year. He's due over $19 million in salary. But a trade, they're only going to save about $8 million against the cap. Okay? That's just the reality of it, because they've had to push money down the line with restructures to give themselves flexibility in previous years. And so this is an ouch. But at least if you trade him and gets assets and you get a decent chunk of cap space, any amount that they eat. Now, how it works in the NFL is that when you trade, you're actually trading contracts. And so it's not like the Cardinals can trade cash. What they would have to do is then to restructure that deal and pay and agree to pay Hopkins a bonus before the transaction is carried out. And then they would carry that against the cap. So Hopkins is due $19+ million in salary. Say the Cardinals decided to, sweeten the deal by eating, quote unquote, $5 million of that, meaning they pay him $5 million before he goes to their team, which means the team that acquires him only pays about $14 million, as they would have for the final 2 seasons. The problem with that is that $5 million comes off of the cap this year. The Cardinals are already only saving $8 million against the cap. They pay him $5 million. They're only going to save $3 million. They're going to carry almost $28 million in dead money, save a total of $3 million against the cap, and won't have DeAndre Hopkins. That doesn't make any sense to me.
No, and it doesn't make sense to expect that would be what happens for them. And so when you look at it, something that, you and I have talked about off the air, like I just don't see them. I think one of the things that Monty Ossenfort's doing, and I think it makes sense, is he's basically saying, like, here, come get him. But this is what we are expecting. And until we get it, we're not going to change our mind or change our asking price, right? Like, and to me that makes sense, because you're looking at a guy that can help your team, and if he's not happy and he doesn't want to do it, then that's on him at that point, right? Like, he's got to make a decision if he's going to play or if he's going to hold out, or what he's going to do. But at some point he has to make a decision if it's not in the best interest for the Cardinals to make that move. And so Monty Ossenfort's job is to, make the best decisions for the organization. And if that includes keeping him on, then, it makes sense to do that. And I think that's where people are getting caught up, is that the Cardinals aren't going to come off their asking price. They might be flexible, but they're not going to come off their asking price until they feel like they're getting what they need from this move.
Yeah, and one thing I don't anticipate them doing is adding any money to the deal. It's kind of this. What this feels like is that there's a bunch of posturing across the board of these teams that want Hopkins but don't want to pay for Hopkins, because he's expensive. He is. He costs a lot, but he's clearly the best receiver that you can get.
But also, this is the reality, and this is something that I think a lot of people miss. He's a 31, I believe.
Will be 31 this season.
Yeah, 31-year-old veteran who hasn't played a full season since his first with the Cardinals, right? Like you said, he's an expensive product, and he's he's been known to be a bit of an enigma in terms of personality. And all of that leads to teams being cautious, because the reality for Hop isn't that he's not great, because he is. I mean, he's probably going in the Hall of Fame. The reality for Hop is that he's a guy who has some baggage in his closet, or skeletons in his closet, if you will. He's a guy that is up there in age, and he's a guy that tends to want to be paid every time his guaranteed money is up. And he's done this now in Houston twice, and now Arizona twice.
And we don't fault players for wanting to do that, because
ever. But that's the thing, is like, he wants to get paid again. So any team that trades for him is like, oh, we're going to have to, give him $45 million guaranteed again. And so that's another thing that comes into it. And I just think that people don't understand that that's where it is, or what it is. Like, it is a hard thing for a team. And so we've seen, Kansas City and Buffalo kind of say like, this isn't going to work for us. It makes sense, because they're like, they're on a budget. They've got these expensive quarterbacks, and they're having to do it.
And then at the same time, can the Chiefs really go into season Marquez Valdes-Scantling as their top receiver? I mean, they managed it with Juju last year,
right?
But yeah,
well, and that's the thing, and it's
a game of chicken right now. It really is.
Yeah, and I just don't think that the Cardinals are going to budge, because there's no reason for them to.
Coming up next on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best of our Cardinals talk on the web. Let's talk about a little bit what Jonathan Gannon said about a scheme-flexible defense. What can we expect from this Cardinals defense in 2023, schematically, personnel-wise? That's coming up next on Rise Up See Red. We're back on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best of our Cardinals talk on the web. Jonathan Gannon, sounding a lot like Steve Kye and Vance Joseph, spoke a lot about guys, and Bruce Arians to that matter, he wants guys that can play multiple positions. He did say he's been firm about not building a scheme for his players to play in, but building a scheme around his players. He also said he doesn't want it to be a copy-paste version of the Eagles' defense, because there are some things he wants to do differently. That said, how exactly flexible schematically do we expect to see the Cardinals this season, Seth?
I think we talked a little bit about it the other day with the offense, right? Like, depending on who the quarterback is. And I think we're going to see that this year as, on defense as well. I think, we have a lot of questions that need to be answered. And I don't think we're going to see exactly what the Jonathan Gannon defense is in year one as they're trying to build it. But I think we are going to see a lot of interesting looks that put players in a position to be successful. And, I think those things are something that we have not heard consistently from, or have been complaints of fans or, critics of the past regimes, where there didn't seem to be any fitting the scheme to the talent. Instead, it was
even though Vance did. He really did.
He
and
tried.
but if we look at some of the changes, because his defensive scheme is primarily generate pressure and play man on the outside. That is he wants to run a Wade Phillips type scheme. He added over the last 2 seasons more, I think partially out of need, but because of Marcus Robertson, one of his I think it was the defensive backs coach, about including more elements of zone, and I think part of that was needed because of the personnel they have. And look at how they changed things up for different. So sometimes you'd see an 8-man front against some teams, and with over the last 3 seasons, the more that they've incorporated Isaiah Simmons, the less 3-4, the less Wade Phillips that defensive front looked. And so I'm like, fans like to say that but Vance did exactly that, especially with the addition of Isaiah Simmons. When he first came to the league, they had literally it was a 4-3 front for them. It's just that went away when he was making mistakes early on when he blew the Raheem Mostert angle and they scored that 70-yard touchdown in the first game of the year, and then he kind of got in the doghouse and had to work his way back. But Isaiah Simmons in particular, they did well, aside from that they had to teach him linebacker, but to fit him in, they really did change it up schematically in terms of personnel looks. We all anticipate that Gannon's defense, and I guess it's technically Rollis's defense, is going to look like a 4-3, especially with the additions they've had. You anticipate Isaiah Simmons, David Collins, Kaiser White. Then you've got Chris Barnes who can sit behind them. And so you figure it's going to be a 4-3 look. It's going to be a matter of how much is man, how much is zone, what different positions do they put MyJ at the rush linebacker? Are they going to have a rush linebacker like Hassan Reddick last year? I'm super intrigued by what we might see.
Yeah, and how they're going to deploy things and what they're going to look at, because like I said, his defense with Fletcher Cox and Javon Hargrave isn't showing up, right? His strengths right now are his linebackers, off-ball linebackers. He's got some interesting pieces in Simmons and MyJ Sanders and Cameron Thomas as edge rushers, and he has the chance to add to that in the draft, obviously. And then the interior defensive line is kind of a mishmash right now, and probably the most underwhelming part, even over the corners of this roster right now. But it's one of those things that I think he's a lot more malleable than what Vance was, because Vance's defenses aren't exactly his defenses, the strengths typically come from being able to rush 4 or 5 and drop a lot into coverage, right? And then, but for whatever reason, and there's a lot of answers to this, and very few are Vance's fault. That wasn't something he could do. And so when you look at it, you've got a guy in Gannon who I think is going to, and like you said, with Rawls, and even the guy they brought in from Florida, whose name's escaping me right now, I think they're going to be a little more flexible and a little more, they're going to take that challenge a little more head on, in terms of trying to find the best way to show this defense being successful, as opposed to, and I'm not saying that Vance did not do that, but like you said, there were a lot of things to overcome, and Vance has his system that he likes to run. He tries to do it consistently, and it just, it never really worked after that hot start in 2021 and JJ Watt getting injured. And again, not Vance's fault that they continued to add off-ball players and not up front interior defensive line players.
Absolutely. Coming up next on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best our Cardinals talk on the web. Let's talk our final little bit of the show, and that would be surprise. The Cardinals are making improvements to their facilities, and it might not have been because of the NFLPA report card. That's coming next on Rise Up See Red. We're back on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best our Cardinals talk on the web. Interesting things is the Cardinals took a hit. They most certainly did. Michael Bidwell, the entire organization, took a hit when the NFLPA released their team report cards. This was a brilliant move by the NFLPA. I'll be honest. It was a very, very astute move by them. Because this was, in most situations, so this was a classic labor versus management type scenario about work conditions. And now say if it's an airline or if it's a grocery store union, they don't necessarily have the means or the bandwidth to be able to publish something of this magnitude, but the NFLPA does because everyone covers the NFL. So on the NFLPA site, they've surveyed their players across the league, asked them to grade different aspects of their work conditions, food, training, facilities, strength, weight room, things like that. The stuff that's not related to the play on the field, it's the stuff of work conditions, like in your classic labor versus management. And then that was exponentially broadcast to the entire world because of NFL media. We all cover the NFL. Everyone who covers a team had something to write about. The big networks, the national networks, the local networks, the small networks. There was stuff to talk about, and the Cardinals took hit because they had 5 failing grades in 5 of the 8 categories. They even had F minuses, which I'll say that's a stupid grade. That's trying to make a statement when you say F minus, because everyone knows that there's nothing worse than an F when you get graded. That said, the Cardinals are making improvements. Jonathan Gannon came in. He's talked to players. He's talked to Michael Bidwell. Michael Bidwell is supposedly on board. They're making improvements. And then the kicker was Albert Breer when he reported some of the things that were happening, is that a lot of those were already in process before Gannon was hired and before the report card came out. And so, to Bidwell's credit, he was perhaps a little forward-thinking, or maybe he was had a heads up, or maybe it was just that time in the cycle of things, because it was just 8 years ago that they put in millions of dollars to upgrade the team facility in the weight room, and there was great publicity about that locally when it happened in 2015. But now you bring in a new coach coming off a really bad grade. It sounds like maybe even players won't have to pay for their own food, right?
Yeah, and I mean, that's the thing is, we've talked to players, we've talked to people outside the organization, we've talked to people that have worked for the organization that weren't players. The reality is, and this, makes sense, and you can speak to it with your Kelvin Beachum conversation, but like, these things are ancillary things for the hyper paid players. JJ Watt, Larry Fitzgerald, obviously now DeAndre Hopkins, Kyler Murray, those guys, the guys that are making money, they realistically work out at their own facilities or their own training facilities or at home. But for guys on the bubble or guys that are, trying to get by, like a David Blau or a guy like, before he got paid, Dennis Gardeck, like those things start to add up, right? Like bad workout facility, bad food. And then, at the end of the day, food you have to pay for out of your pocket that was also said to be bad food, right? Like that. I think that's the part that gets missed by a lot of fans is it's like it's not just that they had to pay for food, but the food was that they were paying for was bad. And so, when you look at it, a guy like, again, Dennis Gardeck, you and I, we obviously don't know what it's like to make NFL minimum, what, $450,000.
And now that's like 750,000 now.
Yeah, and so like you look at it and people go, well, these guys can afford the $15 meal or whatever, $20 meal, whatever it is. But here's the thing, and I say this very truthfully because even with high school athletes, and I have friends that have kids that are in college athletics. I know people that work in college athletics, and then I have friends that work in the NFL that will tell me about this. Like, these guys spend inordinate amounts of money to take care of themselves. There was something the other day about LeBron James. He spends $1.5 million a month for his like health and wellness. Obviously everybody knows about TB12 systems and how much money that was, things like that. And so again, when you're talking about a guy that was, making $400,000, $500,000, $600,000, yes, that's a lot of money to the layman. But when you're talking about having to spend, $8,000 to $10,000 a month to keep yourself in shape personally, then it starts to add up, because like it's not just having to pay the $15 for the food, right? It's or $30 if it's 2 meals, right? It's not having access to good food or clean food, if you will, or these different things. And so that all compiled with, an out-of-date weight room, an unsafe out-of-date weight room, and these type of things, that all compiled to become this grand issue. And like you said, Jonathan Gannon and Monty Osfort are making it a priority to change, because, and this is, you and I have talked about this off the air, whether or not this works, obviously we want it to work, but whether or not this works, the biggest thing that is being attempted is they're trying to change the culture and the outside thought of who the Arizona Cardinals are. And that, I don't think people realize how much of an uphill battle that is, especially within the NFL and NFL media.
Yeah. And then more so with that report card coming out. I will say this. Calvin Beacham has said this. The facility's adequate. In terms of work conditions, it's not bad. It's adequate. Justin Pugh, he said there was other benefits. He downplayed some of the issues that there were at the facility on Twitter, but said but living here, the quality of life is incredible out here. We know we've lived here our whole life. Living in Arizona is pretty fantastic when it comes to, especially this time of year. But the F's that are out there, you have to understand the perspective. These are high performance athletes at the top of their game. And so while if we were to look at, if you've seen pictures of the Cardinals weight room, that's a better weight room than probably any of y'all have worked out in at any point. But is it what is ideal for professional athletes? Maybe, maybe not. And there's different layers of that. And this depends on, as an organization, go back to the days of Mark Cuban and the Dallas Mavericks, when he went over the top with amenities for his players so that other players, opposing players who came in and visited them, would be jealous. It's a strategy that you do. Some people are like, we're going to provide what's adequate because, why do we need to do more than adequate? They do have to keep a minimum. They do have to reach a minimum standard of adequate, and that the question then becomes: was what the Cardinals were doing, was it adequate? The grades say no, but now we're seeing that Bidwill, whether he was tipped off or whether this was just in motion already, because the team had put millions of dollars into the stadium. And it was just coming to the point, they invested millions into the facility 8 years ago. They've invested in the stadium, and now you cycle back around for investment into, facilities. It appears that perhaps it was already on track to happen, but now it's just been amplified.
Right, and that's what they're trying to do, and that's what they're working towards. And at the end of the day, when you look at it, it's one of those things that the reality is the Cardinals are notoriously cheap. Whether it's fair or not, they're notoriously cheap. And a report like this comes out, and it kind of just reinforces
it does.
That, right?
It's like, oh, yep, they're still cheap. Mikey B, he didn't improve anything, because the narrative for a long time is that the Cardinals have made great strides since Michael Bidwill took over, because organizationally they have invested in a lot more things since he took over. If you go back to the Ken Wisenhunt days, they put in the practice bubble. Now they upgraded this, they upgraded that, they upgraded things in the stadium. Michael Bidwill was much better than his son, but now as things have happened, it feels like he's more like his father than we thought he was. But now we get to see it, and they've got to fight that narrative again. This is the narrative about how the organization is run. It's just something it's been an uphill battle, and I don't know if it'll ever be overcome, because I don't know if anyone will ever believe it, because just the name Bidwill, just for a lot of reasons, the franchise's history, the things that come out like this, and because, let's be honest, because of his political leanings compared to, many things going on nationwide, they will always view him negatively no matter what he does.
I think if this team and franchise starts to win, you will see that change. But like you said, they've spent money on things, but they've also, and they're getting hammered for this, and I don't know how I feel about it. And you and I haven't even really talked about it, but like, they're getting hammered for raising ticket prices after losing season, and basically in what looks like a season where they're kind of, tanking. And the reality is, inflation is insane right now, and a lot of other things, but it is a bad look. Let's be honest.
There's no way around that. The message is they have an extra home game. Well, they kind of do, because they lost a home game last year to Mexico, and they're going to play that in the stadium. But there's no good one. But let's be honest, everything's cost. Like, go to McDonald's. That dollar hamburger that you used to buy, it's $3, it's $4. It's literally happening everywhere.
Right.
Doesn't make it any more fun, and the timing looks awful. But there's a number of things. One, inflation. Two, let's be honest, there is perhaps a need for the organization to raise more revenue, because Kyler Murray's contract, Cliff Kingsbury's contract that they're still paying. And so, right. There's a lot of reasons. And here's the thing. What would you rather have done? Would you rather have the Cardinals not fired? This is the question for fans. If keeping Cliff Kingsbury meant ticket prices were down, would you be happy with that? No one would. There was no way this offseason that the Cardinals were going to come away looking good, because either they look like idiots for giving Keim and Cliff Kingsbury those extensions, which they did look like, or everyone's unhappy because they came back. And so, let's be honest. If you were given the choice, Cardinals fans, would you have rather seen ticket prices stay relatively the same, but with Cliff Kingsbury coming back? Or would you rather have the new coaching staff, a new general manager with higher ticket prices?
Yeah, and the other thing is, and I think, and we'll see if it comes true. I mean, we don't know. But if they change out the scouting department, if they start changing those things up, because I think that's been one of the biggest criticisms, is that they've done a lot of things, but they're still basically the same scouting department from what 2001. I'm kidding, but only sort of. And so, I think that's one of the criticisms, and so, but that's the thing is, like, I wrote about it the other day because SB Nation wanted to ask all fan bases, sans a couple, if they want, would want their owner to sell. And it's pretty overwhelming that Cardinals fans do. But I think what people don't realize is how poorly, and this is on Mike, so I don't want this to be, thinking I'm not blaming Mike for this, but how poorly they did with their cap situation and what Monty's trying to do to get them out of it, right? Because I think that's the biggest thing right now, is that people are upset about all of this. But the reality is Monty's trying to clear the decks over the next 2 seasons so they're able to be competitive moving forward.
Right, and be able to develop and to be able to put together the team that he wants to put together with financial flexibility.
Right. And so that's not going to happen with what Steve Keim was notorious for, which was, hey, let's sign this guy to more money than he probably would have received anywhere else. And then we'll kick the can down the road and spread it out over. I mean, think about the guys that they were paying last year that weren't even on the roster, right? Or that had like never been on the roster. And that was just, I mean, and I know there's a lot of teams that do it that way, but that was notoriously Keim, is like, hey, that's a problem for another day. That's not a problem for today, right? And you and I have talked about that, at least a dozen times, about, like, they at some point they've got to figure out, you look back 2021, Devondre Campbell, Malcolm Butler, Brian Winters, right? Like Chris Streveler, like, so that was 21. So 22 was, yeah. But I think it was 2020 was the really, really bad one, if I remember right. But yeah, I mean, that's just it. Yeah, David Johnson, right? Darius Philon, Terrell Suggs, all of these guys that, like, had no impact on the team, and then they were still paying from the year before because, well, they just, and that, it's tough, man. Like, I get it. And you want to be competitive and you want to be, and so, but I think this year they're doing the right thing and really putting themselves in a position to be successful. And I don't mean necessarily immediately, but like you said, in the Monty Ossenfort era, in what he sees as the best, step forward. Yeah, you look at this year's man, Jordan Phillips, Jordan Hicks, Devin Kennard, and then they paid him again. But the worst one was definitely Malcolm Butler, because think about it. This was a dude that didn't even make it out of camp in 2021, but they were still paying him $1.1 million in 2022. Like, it's just like, man, like, I get it. It's a common practice for a lot of teams, but the Cardinals seem to do it with a lot of, like, low end players, right? like a lot of guys that they were like, hey, come back, or we'll sign you to a 1 year, $2.5 million deal, and we'll put that, we'll put 1.5 of it on this year and then 1 million on it next year. And then it's like, oh, he didn't even make the roster, but we'll pay him next year. Don't worry. But yeah, I mean, you look at this year, like already Jordan Phillips, Devon Kennard, AJ Green, all of those guys, those three combined is $10 million. Like that's $10 million in dead cap that you could have to go re-sign a Byron Murphy, right? But you don't have it, and that's not on Monty. So like when people are like, "What is Monty doing?" I'm like, "Go look at the dead cap. That's not on Monty. He's got to deal with the hand he's dealt this year." And again, that's not on Bidwill in this time, in this part, right? Like he's not being cheap. He has 11.5 million in dead cap that he's paying off. The problem is it's on Bidwill from before when he was convinced like, hey, just kick it down the road. We'll deal with it. Like we'll take care of it, in 2 years, 3 years. Like I said, there's no reason Jordan Phillips should be on the cap for $6 million this year. Like there's just no reason.
That was to save room last year. They post June 1st did him because otherwise he was going to count $9 million against the cap last year.
Right. And so that's the thing. But, and we all know this. It's just like having a credit card. Eventually, all those things come due, right?
Yeah, and that's the thing about the cap, if you don't understand it. So any money you have actually paid a player will count against the salary cap at one point or another. You can play around with the books a little bit to push that money down the line with void years, this and that, paying bonus restructures to lower hit 1 year. But if money has gone to a player, it will be accounted for in the books at some point. That's right. Just how that works.
Right, and you can literally just keep pushing it, right? You're like, oh, we'll do.
If it's not one guy, if you're not doing it to one player's contract, you're doing it to another player's contract to make room for this player's contract that's dead.
Right, and that's just the unfortunate reality of what this organization decided to do, and now they're in a position, and it's funny because this all ties in, right? Why are they being so stingy or so pig-headed with the DeAndre Hopkins trade? Well, because it's going to just be more dead cap money on their salary next year. Like Monty Ossenfort's literally just trying to do the opposite of that.
Yes.
He's trying
he's clearing the books because the 22.6 million account this year. But if they trade him mid-season, guess what? There is 11 million next year.
Right.
There's 11 million dead cap next year if they trade him after June 1st. So you either you get him off the books now and you take the this year hit, and now you don't have to worry about it moving forward.
Yeah, so that's just, that's where they're at, and I think Michael wants to do the right thing, but he's also still trying to run a business, and it's not just as easy as like doing it all at once, right?
Yeah, totally. So with that, we will wrap up this edition of the Rise Up Secret podcast of SR Cardinals Talk. This is episode 412. I will drop a solo pod in the weekend that will specifically deal with the projected win totals for the teams around Cross Elite. So if you care anything about that, have a listen to it. I'll give you my thoughts on the lines for each team in the NFL. But we will have a show again next week because we are now going to start. We will start getting into draft content. We'll look how we're going to divide that up over the next few weeks as we have 4 weeks till the draft. That's Seth Cox. I'm Jess Root. This is the Rise Up Secret podcast. We'll be back soon. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to the latest edition of the Rise Up See Red podcast. Listen to previous episodes and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, Audioboom, or many other podcast platforms so shows are delivered directly to your mobile device. Please give the show a 5-star rating and always support the sponsors who support the show. We'll be back soon for the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Rise up, Red Sea, be red, see red, and of course, rise up, see red.